If we want to solve the police problem, we need to solve the race problem first, because it jives with a certain kind of talk that I hear on the right, which is, look, there is so much crime and violence and really bad, vicious, dangerous behavior. I've been to too many crime scenes. I've seen too many homicides, over 10,000 blacks killed in a year, et cetera, et cetera. There's so much that. The people who have to deal with it inevitably, there's going to be excess. That doesn't excuse the excess, but it does help us to account for it. Hello, everybody. This is Glenn Loury. You've tuned into The Glenn Show, Substack.com and YouTube. The Glenn Show is sponsored by the Manhattan Institute for Policy Research in New York City, where I am John Paulson Senior Fellow. This week, we're with John McWhorter, as we are every other week. Glenn and John act, and we're joined by Peter Moskos. Peter is professor of criminology at John Jay College of Criminal Justice, City University of New York. He's a former police officer serving in Baltimore City, and he's a PhD in sociology who has a lot of knowledge about policing and law enforcement in urban America, and he's agreed to join us today. So thanks, Peter.
Thanks for having me back.
All right. Well, you know why we're having you back. We're having you back. And by the way, Peter has been a guest previously on numerous occasions on The Glenn Show, and we've talked about the kind of stuff we're talking about today, sadly, which is the killing in Memphis, Tennessee by police officers of a Black youth, young man named Tyre Nichols, which has gotten attention throughout the country and throughout the world for that matter. And everybody's talking about it. The city of Memphis released video of this event. It's very brutal, and it raises a lot of questions about policing in America. What's your general impression, Peter, both about the incident itself and about how it was handled by the authorities in Memphis and about the reaction that it has engendered throughout the country?
And Peter, also, if I may jump very quickly in, this case seems to be, so egregious you can barely believe it. And I've often said on this show that I have learned that in these cases, the story is never what we're initially told. This time it looks like it is. Is there something we don't know? Or is this one really just the utter horror show that it seems to be?
Both, I think. Let me just start with the utter horror show, because I think that needs to be put out front. We're seeing brutal and criminal acts by cops. Even in other cases where there are brutal and criminal acts by cops, there can be some, mitigating isn't the right word because it doesn't lessen the act, but they're extenuating circumstances where you kind of go, oh, I don't agree with that, but the guy said this, the guy hit the cop. There was some extenuating circumstance that doesn't justify it, but helps explain it at least.
Right.
In this case, we don't see any of that. It is just police brutality combined with police incompetence, which is a horrible combination. What we still don't know is why he was stopped. And there is other video out there that hasn't been released, and I can't figure out why it hasn't been released. And I don't want to start or even spread rumors, though I've heard them. I find it very odd that the video starts where it does. Now, in one sense, it doesn't matter, because it doesn't matter what would happen before in terms of what happened afterwards. He could have shot and killed a cop, honestly, before that, and it wouldn't defend the cop's actions in this case. But I would like to know what the hell the story is. My guess is, look, police withhold information for good reasons, bad reasons, and just incompetent reasons. But why don't we know what happened at the stop? I assume it would make things worse for the cops, but I don't know. But there is video still out there. Perhaps it's for the criminal, being held by the prosecutor for some reason. It's possible, but we don't quite know everything yet. But what we do know is enough to pass judgment and condemnation of the case. The incompetent part I want to point out is because after he is pulled from the car, there are three cops, and the guy Nichols gets up and runs away because he's afraid for his life. The fact that he was able to run away is shocking to me as a former cop. I mean, that's just, what the hell? There are 3 cops there and he got up and run away. Had the cops simply been brutal and competent, Nichols would still be alive. The real ass whooping happened after they chased and got him, and that's also on police because that situation never should have arisen. So that's just, I don't know, it's just a detail, but it just shows what a horrible shit show it was from the police perspective.
Now, a lot of people on the right are making the point that the recruiting efforts to bring Black officers onto the force was associated with a lowering of standards that is partly implicated in the poor policing behavior of the individuals in question here. The 5 individuals, I believe it is, that have been charged, all were Black. And I find that argument, it could conceivably have merit, but it is a very distasteful point to be making in the context of what has happened. I'm wondering how you react to that, Peter. That, for example, I heard
similarly, it is very distasteful. It's not inconceivable. Police departments are having a tough time hiring, and it's almost inevitable that standards will be lowered, and lower standards means worse police officers. But we don't know that in this case. We don't know what that story was. So I do think that's an odd reaction to have to blame it on that. No, and it's not like we didn't have these incidents occasionally a few years ago when it was easier to hire cops.
Okay, so that's a red herring.
I mean, yeah. Though there's a good warning there, which is, I mean, just in general, I am worried about police retention and recruitment. And so I do worry that we're going to have worse policing in the future because departments are so desperate for cops right now. You see these incredibly small police academy classes that do not replace those who are quitting. And that's troublesome. In a way, it's good because if you're only graduating, Baltimore had 13 cops, where my class had 50. Oakland just had a class of 17. It implies they're not lowering standards because they don't have enough cops out there. It could be both. But that is a separate issue from what we're talking about here in this beating, this killing.
Were you surprised that there
Peter,
wasn't
what do you
more
think about
protest and reaction in the wake of the killing? Things seem to remain relatively peaceful, all things considered.
They did remain relatively peaceful. There was a lot of chatter that. So the Memphis Police Department withheld the videos, said they were horrible, and then released them on Friday night, which perhaps is not the best time to release police brutality videos if you're worried about civic disorder. That said, from a nationwide policing perspective, it seems to have worked. Now, the key thing, though, I don't think is the timing of the release. It's that the officers were quickly held accountable in the sense that they were fired and criminally charged. I mean, the first time really we saw that was with George Floyd, in the sense that the office, it wasn't immediate, it wasn't as quick, but the traditional rallying cry, going back to, Al Sharpton in the 90s or 80s was, no justice, no peace. So here we do have justice in the sense that we have a justice system. I mean, it's not always satisfying justice, but the system is working at that level. And maybe that's what we want, I think, because I don't know, after these happened, I don't know what else the alternative is. So that might have taken some of the sting out of it. Or maybe the public has just reached a point where they can't handle another video and don't think about it, and just pre-existing opinions are confirmed or not. But I'd like to think it's because these officers are being held accountable, which is why people weren't out. Well, a few people were out there breaking stuff, but generally we didn't have the mass protests.
Well, remember also that if that were 5 white guys, I think there would have been protests. I mean, the fact that it was brothers, as a lot of people put it,
Do you?
makes it different. That probably has something to do
I
with it.
think so too. I mean, this was unique in the sense that everybody, there have been some white cops that have been fired, and I think charged, maybe not yet. There have been others other than the 5. I think when the video was released, the sheriff department said, hey, we had some guys there too. Maybe they didn't know that. So they got fired after the video was released. There's issues with the paramedic or the fire department too. But the 5 cops who were pictured and were the main culprits in the killing, and the police chief, let's not forget, and the victim, everyone's black. Now, of course, and you've talked about this a lot in your show, people want to say it's still an example of white supremacy and all that. But at some point, you kind of go, no, this race was not the main factor here, or a factor even, potentially. And I think John's right that helps influence public opinion.
People were not as angry. Excuse me, John. I just want to clarify that the point is that people were not as angry as they might otherwise have been because the cops were black and not white in this context.
You know what I find interesting is one would think that the anti-policing crowd would jump on this point that I'm about to make, because in a way it serves the anti-policing agenda better. And I've said this, and I know John has said this too, in relation to what I've written. But this is a police problem. It's not a race problem. It might be it's America. There's an underlying race problem always hovering over everything. But this issue is a police problem, and unless we address it as a police problem, we're not going to solve it. It's the exclusive focus on race that is part of the problem, because we're not getting to the source of it, which is bad cops, a combination of bad cops, bad leadership, bad training, bad supervision. Where was the sergeant in all this? That's another question I want to know about this. You're going to solve this departmentally by departmentally through accountability and good leadership. It is almost always these sort of specialized units that get into trouble. And there was a Washington Post column yesterday saying we have to abolish all these specialized units. Well, every city has them. And it seems, I don't know, every 5 years, every 10 years, since 1990, or, there've been a half dozen cases. But there are hundreds of these units out there, hundreds of day every year. The answer when something like this happens isn't to say we need to get rid of policing in whatever form. But we do need to make sure these happen as little as possible. But, every time this happens, and I'll say it again, it's going to happen again. We know that. It's a criminal activity. The idea that this should never happen is ideal. It's unrealistic. It's like any crime. You got more than 600,000 cops out there. Most of them are young men of varying degrees of, maturity and intellectual development. Let's just put it politely. It's irresponsible to be completely shocked that this happens in the abstract. It's going to happen. It's happened before. It'll happen again. The question is, how do we lessen it, and what do we do about it? But and it's not to excuse it, but it is inevitable at some point. But we can certainly make sure it happens less. And part of that, I think, is by charging these cops and not covering it up and things like that. But this specialized unit was clearly poorly run. There's no supervision there. And also, we don't know, but the way they did this, it doesn't look like the first time. We're going to hear more stories. They seem pretty routine in the way they beat him.
In their brutality.
In their brutality, yeah. I mean, at one point, I've seen a lot of videos of people getting beat up. So the actual beating, I'll say, did not shock my conscience because I've seen too many of these damn things. But the one part that did make me go, oh shit, was at some point the cop, like one of them's holding him and one of the cops slugs him like 5 times. And that to me took it to another level. They also, the fact that they were incompetent and couldn't get him to cuffs in the first place means maybe they were just incompetent later, but no, they could have cuffed him. They didn't want him cuffed because they wanted to keep beating him. That's my take on it. Because interestingly, once they did finally put him in cuffs, they did stop beating him then. So even they had some weird code that they were abiding by. But yeah,
well, by then he was
the event did shock.
Semi-conscious and slumped over and sitting on the street curb with his back against the vehicle. I mean, it was just...
Yeah, and it still took a half hour from that point before the ambulance came, which is another...
But I want to go back to this issue of whether it is or is not a race problem. You say it's a policing thing, not a race thing, but the counter to that would be this wouldn't have happened if the guy had been white. Do you agree with that, Peter?
I don't.
Simply
There's
because
no way to know. Yeah.
I mean, yeah, in this case, who knows? I don't know what those cops would have done, but I mean, yeah, there are tons of videos out there of cops shooting white people for no good reason and being brutal to white people. And people generally don't see them because they don't get the coverage in the national media without the race angle. But I mean, cops shoot white people too. Cops beat white people too. Is it disproportionately black, the victims of police brutality? Well, it depends on what the denominator is. I mean, the short answer is yes. But in the same disparities, I think that police interact with people generally. Again, this case, again, it was just, that's why I want to see what led up to this. But this guy was not presenting himself in some thug-like fashion. At one point, he's saying, the cops are telling him to get on the ground, and he kind of looks back and goes, I am on the ground. And of course, what he didn't know, like I knew what the cops meant, which is when the cop says get on the ground, they mean get on the ground, flat spread eagle. He didn't know that, and why should he? All he knows is he's on the ground.
I'm going to venture this. I'm never going to write it. I'm just going to venture it here, wondering what set these guys off. Because, there is just human brutality. I hate to say this, but the only thing I can imagine, and Peter, I'll bet you've thought of this too, and I don't know the answer, was Tyre Nichols effeminate? Were they disgusted with him for some brutal reason like that, such that they start beating him down because they don't like guys like that? It's the only thing I can think of. And of course, it would not remotely justify it. But why him? Why then? Why that mean? And what it almost looks like is the sort of thing that gay men have often suffered at the hands of cops. Just wondering. I haven't heard his voice clearly. And frankly, it would come out in voice,
I don't know. I don't think so, because
we haven't read about it.
We haven't read about it. I don't think he didn't strike me as that effeminate is one reason.
Right.
And I don't know, cops are used to dealing with all types, and most of them don't get beat up. So
just trying to think of what set them off.
Well, partly, I'll say I don't know. Again, when the video starts, he's pulled from the car too aggressively. What set them off was that they maced each other. That's important. It doesn't justify it, but if you haven't been maced, and you're not going to get this from the video, you don't realize how painful it is. So once you get maced, it's a game changer.
They maced each other by accident, trying to mace him.
Yeah, further incompetence. But when you get mace in your eye, I mean, remember, this is a substance that is designed to be incapacitatingly painful. And it, won't kill you, and you can fight through it, but they've all been maced. And so that sets them off. Emotionally, physically, and I mean, it's
Do they think he maced them?
No, they know they were maced by cops, but it doesn't matter. Mace is so painful. So you're dealing with these guys who are already have their adrenaline flowing, and now they've been maced. So that, again, I don't mean this in any way to defend it, but that set them off. And of course, it was their fault, but they have been maced. The whole thing is, them dealing with that. And so then they take it out on Nichols. I've been hurt, even though they were hurt by another cop.
Peter, can I ask you this too? There's a shoe that hasn't dropped. I was surprised that this wasn't the immediate response, that the guys were fired only because they're black, that if white cops had done this, they wouldn't have been fired, and so this isn't a milestone. Why haven't we heard that? I'm really surprised that hasn't been the first thing that people started writing about this from a certain spectrum.
I have heard it. It's funny, when I saw their pictures, that was joking to myself, my first thought was that, Like, oh, look, they're all black, so they were fired. I think in this situation, had it been white cops with the same chief, she would have made the same decision. I don't know. Who can say? I think that was her form of damage control. And partly, I think it's because the department, this has to go higher. This is the systemic problem is in the Memphis Police Department. They didn't have supervision for this. So I'm a little, I'm happy they were fired, but I'm also a little suspicious of the motives. I think it is to place them as fall guys here and to not have to look deeper. I mean, at some point, this does go up to the chief. That's where the buck stops. And I don't think she's accepted that responsibility, that accountability yet. But would have they been fired if they're white? I don't know. We're in a different time, I think, where people are, we're firing these cops when possible, is being more of the chosen path. But, I don't think in New York City you could fire them that quickly. I mean, so there are union rules and so on, and I don't know the contract in Memphis, but she was able to, apparently. Of course, you're always able to. The question is, if it's unjustified, then they get reinstated later with back pay. But that you can at least kick that can down the road.
What happens to cops like that?
Sorry, John, I didn't mean to interrupt. What were you saying?
I was going to say, what do they go do? What happens to those guys? Do they ever get another job? Yeah.
Well, they're fired and charged criminally, so that they got to deal with the criminal charge. The case that's coming up. So that's what's on their mind right now. But presuming that the firing is upheld, and I'm pretty sure in this case it will be. I mean, they're screwed. They're out of work. They're not going to get another job easily. So, I mean, their lives are ruined. Oh well. But
I wanted to ask you, Peter, about the Scorpion. This is the special anti-drug gun police unit that these guys were a part of that some have called to be disbanded, not just in Memphis. And you resist that. And I want to know how these specialized, I almost want to say warrior cop units fit within the larger policy frame of policing in a city like Memphis. What's the function and purpose of these, and why do you resist the call for them to be disbanded?
Because somebody's got to take the guns off people. Excuse me for a second. Somebody's got to take the guns off armed people, and it's not easy work. It's not dangerous work. Most cops don't want to do it. And if you don't have these units, no one's going to do that. It's not going to happen on patrol. It's not that social workers are going to somehow do this. It is the consistently most dangerous part. I mean, you're taking guns off armed people who are ready to use it. That is part of policing. And if you don't have these units, it's just not going to happen. Often when these units are disbanded, you saw it, violence will go up. There is a purpose that these units serve in terms of crime prevention. I don't know, again, this unit I don't want to give any credit to because of what happened in the apparent lack of leadership and supervision, but murders did plummet last year in Memphis for what it's worth. I don't know if that was because of this unit. Might have been. It's not inconceivable. But the idea that you're going to have effective policing without proactive policing going after repeat violent offenders, it's a political decision. We can say, look, we'd prefer for 20 more people to get murdered next year and not have the risk of this unit doing this. The other thing, though, is if you get rid of these units, those cops are still going to be there. They're just going to be, you might just be pushing the brutality somewhere else. Now, there is a concentrating influence here, and that's why the supervision of these units is so vitally important, because you are attracting these alpha males, the cops who want to be in these units, the cops, and when you put them all together, the risks exponentially increase. And so, yeah, you are playing with fire a little bit, but most police departments manage to, contain that flame day in and day out quite well. And that's why it's important to say these still are outlier cases, and that doesn't mean that it doesn't mean they won't happen again, and it doesn't lessen what happens, but it's not the norm even for these units. But there's a greater risk with those units.
What are they doing?
Also, Memphis, like all cities, in a couple of years, they're going to reinstitute this unit and they're going to give some other acronym. It'll be back.
What are they
it always
doing?
happens that way.
I'm just trying to get down into the nitty gritty about the policing. How are they conducting themselves as police officers on the street differently in virtue of having the charge of getting guns out and dealing with the hard cases?
The difference, and I think it does happen when you have these units and that more aggressive type of cop who chooses to be in that. No one gets involuntarily assigned to these units. It is considered, special and elite, though I don't want to call this unit elite because that has positive connotations. Some of it is, again, the nature of the work that you're more constantly dealing with armed people, armed criminals. Some of it, though, and if you have one of these people in your squad, you might not like the way they operate, but at least that person is getting the stink eye from the rest of the squad for the way they operate if they're treating people rudely or unnecessary. And if you don't have the positive peer pressure of more restrained cops, you're more likely to keep escalating your behavior. I think that's just sort of a group dynamic that happens when you have, squads of a dozen people or whatever. And so that is where the supervision is so key. That the sergeant, which is people all outside of in policing, sort of everyone will say the sergeant's the most important rank because it's that middle ground between the upper level cops and the street cops, and the sergeant is still on the street. Where above that, often you're not on the street or not very often. The sergeant's level is where this gets prevented. Along with, of course, when cops do something bad, you got to call them out and you got to discipline them, you got to punish them and fire them. But that's going to happen at the level from the sergeant. It's the sergeant's job. Ideally, the sergeant prevents bad behavior. So that in terms of preventing these kind of things in the future, that's where police departments have to look.
Listening to the speeches at the funeral of Tyre Nichols, Benjamin Crump gave a long speech. Al Sharpton gave a long speech. The main policy response they seem to be calling for.
What was your reaction to Sharpton, Dr. Loury?
Well,
he's now our elder statesman, right?
Exactly. That was going to be the way.
I listen to you guys. I know what you say. Come on.
Yeah, well, John and I have somewhat different views about Al Sharpton, and John can speak for himself. I'm not a big Sharpton fan, but, John?
He's changed.
No, I want to ask a question, though. And John and I can get into that more in the second half of our post today, because, I definitely want to talk about Al Sharpton. But I want to talk about qualified immunity. I want to talk about the George Floyd police reform legislation in the Congress. And I want to get your expert police criminology take on reform. Qualified immunity, which is the legal doctrine shielding law enforcement officers from personal liability in the case of these kinds of incidents. And I'm just wondering, Peter, how you come down on that. What do you think about that?
I feel my legal knowledge isn't good enough to really get into the nitty-gritty of it. I don't fully understand. I do a bit, but I don't fully understand the immunity doctrines. Partly, though, I haven't learned about it, but I think it's a red herring. I don't think that, I don't know if it's good or bad, but it's not going to fix it. First of all, there's also such a thing as total immunity that prosecutors and legislators have. So police are not unique, and they're qualified as a lesser standard. At some point, public servants need to be allowed to make honest mistakes without getting sued. If we're worried about increasing the quality of police, getting rid of qualified immunity is not going to help recruitment, retention, and so on. If it's just on the police departments, it's one thing. But the truth is, qualified immunity and maybe it doesn't affect many cases because it exists. So there might be a sort of a tautology there. But these cops are being criminally charged. Qualified immunity doesn't change that. So I'm not quite certain what the benefits of getting rid of that would be. But again, I'm a little hesitant to talk too much about it because of my own ignorance.
Fair enough. John, anything further?
I think the fascinating thing about the whole thing, and Glenn, you and I can talk about this too, is the idea that you see that it was black guys, and the typical response from the three name world, basically, and a lot of them don't have three names, but I think everybody who watches this knows who those people are, is that you have to decide that they're operating within a structure of white supremacy. Now, that's kind of a very kind of sleight of hand thing, because it's supposed to be that if it's Derek Chauvin, then he kills George Floyd because he's a racist. But then if it's these five guys, they're operating nobody wants to say racist because it looks so implausible that these black guys were racists in that way and killed him because he's black. So you use this term of art, white supremacy, which means that the police forces have been assigned to pay more attention to poor black neighborhoods and to devalue black life in some way, in a systemic way. It's systemic. It's not about bigotry. But that's different. If that's what it is, if it's this abstract thing called the structural racism, where it's just that impacts are different upon black people, that's different from somebody with a baton who's white beating somebody to death because they're black. So it seems to me that all this talk about white supremacy and therefore it's the same old thing doesn't work. It's these people wanting to make a certain kind of music and finding it inconvenient that this isn't five Derek Chauvins, and instead it's these five guys with their very black American names. They're not even mixed. One of them isn't Hispanic. They're black American guys. And I've been a little bit disgusted by that because it's whack. I think the best person who addressed it was Thomas Chatterton Williams, but all the other three name people, like the three name people who aren't him, are insisting on a certain narrative by misusing language, if you ask me. Peter, what do you think?
I'll leave the sort of more macro theoretical white supremacist argument to you two later, but I think there's some truth to that. But it also, when these incidents happen, part of me wonders who actually wants to reduce this happening. Now, I think everyone wants innocent people not to get beat, not to get killed by cops. So there's that sense, yes, people don't want to see pain inflicted. But there are two ideologies out there that I think kind of enjoy when these incidents happen, because then they can beat their own drum pounding it. One is that the three name people you talk about, but the other are just police abolitionists. And they don't want better policing because they want no policing. And so these incidents are useful to their cause, to what they want. This highlights the incidents. But what worries me is again, I'm afraid that a lot of people who claim to advocate for police reform don't actually want better policing. That's not what they want. This isn't my first rodeo on this. Professionally, I've been doing this now for 2 decades. I and others, have been working in that slow, unsexy, incremental way to make things better. And by and large, there has been slow, incremental progress on these issues. But it's troublesome when people who claim to want better policing want no policing. And I think they need to get called out. And abolitionists, they might be decent people, and they might even have a noble goal, and reasonable people can differ, but they shouldn't have a table at the police reform movement that is trying to make policing better. Policing will only get better when you work with police departments. That even if it's imposed on police departments or comes from within the police department, but the police have to. They are almost by definition. That's who we're talking about. So to exclude them from the debate and say they're the problem, so we have to do A, B, and C, is not going to make things better.
I agree. I agree with you, Peter, but I got to do this, the devil's advocate here, because I can hear my friend Khalil Gibran Muhammad at the Kennedy School, you know who I'm talking about, say the following. Nobody said that it was a straightforward white supremacy, that somehow those guys were white people in blackface who did this. What we're saying is there's a culture of violence characteristic of policing in urban areas with lots of blacks. And if you are a police officer in that situation, you imbibe that culture and you reflect it in your behavior. And it's that culture,
We
not the
all drink
attitudes of
from
the
the same
individual
well, is
actors.
what a friend of mine put it, who grew up in East Baltimore and was a police officer there. That's true. So where do
The white
so now?
supremacists, well.
Well, I think if we dealt into the more descriptive part, I don't know. I prefer to focus on the less theoretical aspects. Um, I what do we do with that knowledge? We have a revolution. We say we're only going to get things better when we eliminate white supremacy. I mean, you've talked about this before. Well, you're putting your fate in the hands of these white supremacists to make themselves better. We have to deal with it to some extent. Again, we can try and get a more fair deck of cards here, but right now we got to deal with the cards as they're dealt. We don't want to stop policing communities that need policing because of the high levels of violence. So I find that argument one step too removed, two steps too theoretical to actually make things better. It doesn't mean it's wrong even, but it's almost irrelevant in terms of what we're going to do here and now. If I can say one thing, John, you have said in the past that to solve the race problems in America, we're going to have to solve the police problem. I was thinking yesterday, in a way, maybe it's the other way around. And partly because of this instance, in which there were very few white people involved, maybe we need to solve the race problem before we can solve the police problem. The causal order there might be, or maybe we can solve them together, but I don't see the police problem being solved with the exclusive focus on race that we have, and I don't know which is easier to deal with.
It's interesting. I think of the naive Martian observer who comes down and just observes the facts would be mystified at the way, say, a Khalil Gibran talks about this, when there are all these stories we never hear about, to me, stereotypically, and Peter, I know this from you. It's always like Colorado or Arizona, some poor, lower class white boy gets killed for no reason, and nobody hears about it beyond the local news there for about 3 minutes. And yet, again and again, somebody will say, well, these people are sucked into this white supremacist system. Well, that's the way it is in that city that has a lot of black people in it. But in terms of who's getting killed by the cops under what conditions, the idea that it's a racialized problem is so clearly a narrative that a certain mainstream media is wedded to, that is quite different from a reality that would be perceived by different eyes if we started all over again. Getting beyond race would be not treating the Daniel Shavers as inconvenient evidence. They would be in our heads every bit as much as the Laquan McDonalds. But I don't see how that would happen. Somebody like Khalil Gibran simply will not do that. They're as close to that as Donna is to a lot of our views. And so how do you fix that?
Well, you have to push back on the idea that policing by nature is part of the white supremacist system. I mean, look, if everything is part of the system and everything is white supremacy, then yeah, I guess police fall under the umbrella. But this idea that the purpose of police was to oppress black people, in the North, it's ahistorical. It's just wasn't the issue. The reason that argument is used is to get to police abolition. So that's why it's a faulty theoretical framework. Certainly in the North, and there's a sort of two histories of policing in America, Southern and Northern. I went and looked at the what was Frederick Douglass' newspaper called in Rochester? Yeah, two of them, but they're all in the Library of Congress. And in the 1850s, might have been early 1860s. I think in the 1850s, Rochester set up their first new police department, the New Police, as it was called, based on the New York City model, which was based on the London model of 1829, and that's the descendants. And I was curious, What did Frederick Douglass say about the police coming to Rochester? He said nothing. Now, maybe I missed it. I did not read every word of every page, but I did a thorough search from the Library of Congress things and search for police and stuff. He mentioned occasional police incidents, sometimes favorably, sometimes not. But the fact that when police came to Rochester, and Frederick Douglass, who was not known to hold his tongue, had no objection to it. That to me is a pretty strong piece of evidence to say that no, the foundation of police was not white supremacy, because if it were, we would have heard about it from Frederick Douglass, I would think.
Well, not in 1850s in Rochester, New York, certainly not. I would imagine the Irish, rather than the blacks, would have been the ones complaining about law enforcement. But I wanted to go back to your thing about maybe if we want to solve the police problem, we need to solve the race problem first, because it jives with a certain kind of talk that I hear on the right, which is, look, there is so much crime and violence and really bad, vicious, dangerous behavior. I've been to too many crime scenes. I've seen too many homicides, over 10,000 blacks killed in a year, et cetera, et cetera. There's so much that. The people who have to deal with it inevitably, there's going to be excess. That doesn't excuse the excess, but it does help us to account for it. If you don't want incidents like this, get more fathers in black households. Get better behavior out of the miscreants in those communities. Because if you don't, there are inevitably going to be these kinds of encounters, and the driving force here is crime, not policing.
Well, we can have, the nuance, which is not very nuanced, is people want more policing and better policing. And they're not mutually exclusive. And somebody in a high crime neighborhood can dislike cops on a personal level and still understand that they're necessary. It's the people who don't live in the communities that seem to forget the fact that people still want policing, even if they're unhappy with the standard of policing being delivered. I mean, really, only a fool thinks that neighborhoods are going to be safer without cops. It's just, but that's, the Overton window of discussion since Ferguson, but since Floyd in particular, has just shifted so far to this idea where people, just say, well, talk about police abolition. My local city council person openly, advocates for that. And people sort of, nod their head going, oh, yeah. No. It's a bad idea. But then to sort of make that argument, you have to understand, you have to then also push back on the idea that, policing, the purpose of policing is the oppression of the black community or whatever. We have to get back to those ideals that, police, it's a civilian controlled organization, and it's there for the people. It's a public service, flawed, but it's a public service, and that has to be the starting point, is how can we deliver the services best, doing the least harm and most effectively and with greatest satisfaction. But just by being in that radical center category, and it in the academic world, it puts me on the far right of these issues, which I find just so it's so negligent, because we on the left, I don't include you in that, Glenn, but we on the left have basically abdicated lowercase crime and order to the Trumpian right. And that's not the solution either. So, Biden, for all his, Biden has an opportunity here. Biden does not dislike policing or cops. I'm not so certain about his vice president. But there is a role for the federal government. Policing is local, but the federal government, it will cost money, though. I mean, that's the problem. But there could be national standards. There could be cops hired again, like the 94 crime bill at the federal level to give money to police departments. They could set up a training center at a national level. You'd have to pay for it, so local departments would send their cops there. We could just have data collection. I mean, isn't it amazing? Maybe to me, data collection has gotten worse because of the shift to neighbors and from UCR, and that's another issue. But we still don't collect The federal government still can't tell you how many people cops killed. They have to estimate how many people are murdered in this country last year. And presumably it'll get a little better as this new system goes into play, but maybe not. I mean, why are we still having these problems? So that's those type of things are one of the few things that could happen nationally. Though generally this, police departments, the improvement's going to happen at a local level, and that just makes it hard because we got tens of thousands of departments and most are really small. But that's America.
Mm-hmm.
Peter, I want to thank you for your time coming on here at the Glenn Show, talking with me and John about policing in the light of the Memphis situation. We're going to excuse you so John and I can commiserate for a few minutes before we close out.
All right. Thanks for having me. It's great to see both of you.
Peter, perfect.
Don't close
Perfect.
that window
Absolutely.
until you get all your files uploaded, Peter.
Okay. But I'll click leave, right? So you can talk about me?
Yeah, you can leave so we can talk
bye-bye.
about you.
Take care.
See you, Peter.
Bye-bye. Oh, John, did you see the
He's the
funeral?
best. I listened to it. Yeah.
Okay.
What did you think?
I thought it was quite a spectacle. Vice President Kamala Harris was there. The mayor of Atlanta, Keisha Lance Bottoms, was there. The mayor of
Quite
New Orleans.
simply, if the person murdered were white, none of those people would have been there. And that angered me.
Well, there wouldn't have been a
because just
national
that-
broadcast on cable news and on radio of the funeral either.
All of that is a statement that what killed him was his color. And I think that's a willfully simplistic analysis, and all of them were buying right into it.
Funeral was broadcast live on cable networks, MSNBC and CNN, but not on Fox News. I shifted around. This was in the afternoon on Wednesday. Why was I watching cable news in the afternoon on Wednesday? It's a long story. Let's not go into it. But when I noticed that the funeral was on, I thought, yeah, I probably have a professional obligation to watch this thing. And it went on for over an hour. Sharpton gave a eulogy that was very passionate, eloquent, I must say, powerful. He invoked Martin Luther King Jr. because we were in Memphis and that's where King had been killed. And he invoked the mountaintop speech. I've been to the mountaintop. I've seen the promised land. I may not get there with you, this kind of thing. And Sharpton likened himself to King indirectly by pointing out he was a climber too. He's on the mountain too. He hasn't quite gotten to the top, but he's, following in the good fight kind of thing like that. Sharpton is the civil rights leader for Black America of our time. I think that point was underscored. Benjamin Crump,
I don't think
introduced
of him
by
that way.
Sharpton, gave a long speech in which he did the lawyer's thing. Sharpton introduced Benjamin Crump as the Attorney General of Black America, quote, unquote. Michael Eric Dyson was there. Talk about people with three names. Sharpton pointed to Michael Eric Dyson in the audience, calling him the Socrates of our time, quote, unquote. And I watched this spectacle unfold. And here, I had two thoughts. John, please tell me why I'm wrong. One was, this is a performance, a scripted enactment. I could have almost written the script before it even happened. This was a show. Not to take anything, no disrespect intended to the family who were burying their loved one who had been brutally murdered by police. No, really, no disrespect intended. But I watched our vice president at that gathering, and she was playing a certain kind of role, and it was a certain kind of dramatic enactment. And we're really good at it. It put on a good show. It sent chills up my spine. It's in a Black church. Everybody is hallelujah and whatnot. And the cadences and the intonations and the evocations, they were all really quite familiar to me. And they were at some level comforting as I got wrapped into this narrative about oppression and struggle and race and whatnot. I thought that. I thought it was a show. But I'm going to say this. I consulted my wife about whether or not I should say this in public, and I'm going to say this. 3 days ago, she and I entertained ourselves one evening by going to Amazon Video and digging out Spike Lee's Bamboozled.
That
This
was
is
one
an
of
old
his.
film. Yeah,
That was one of
sorry.
his lesser efforts, and I've seen every single one of his films. I did not know what he was trying to say, but I remember it very well. Yeah.
So the plot of it is that there's an ambitious black scriptwriter for a TV network who wants to get ahead in life, and he comes up with the idea. I know what I'll do. I know what we need a hit show. Here's my hit show.
Damon
We're going to
Wayans,
reenact blackface, kind of a minstrel show like
Manton
characters,
Moreland. Right?
And we're going to play that card. We're going to play the blackface minstrel card and draw an audience in that way. And Spike Lee uses that as a device for, plumbing the ambition, authenticity, identity, the commercialism of the media, the sort of amorality and whatever. I'm not a movie critic. I'll just leave it at that. But in so doing, filmically, he has to capture these images. So I know, for example, how you make blackface because you burn the cork, you mix in the water, you have to put something on your face to protect the cocoa butter or something before you put the blackface. I know about these, items that people would keep in their homes where they would have a mammy or something, or about these posters and adverts. This is from the earlier period of Jim Crow, where the Negro with the red lips and the big eyes bulging and the Step and Fetch It kind of, the Amos and Andy kind of, that's all been brought back. And I could not get out of my head the thought that there was a way in which that, God, this is horrible. It's horrible. But I just said, this is a coon show. There's something almost undignified about it, John. God help me. I watched the enactment and I thought people are going through the motions, and especially in virtue of the fact that Al Sharpton was in the chair. I'm not a big fan of Al Sharpton. And Benjamin Crump, author of The Witness Fraud of the Trayvon Martin hoax, was running the show. The chair, the Reverend Al Sharpton, his National Action Network, were the organizers. They thanked local people for bringing them in. And you got the sense that this is a traveling road show. As Peter says, there will be another such incident. And when it happens, we're going to enact another such ritual. I couldn't help but think that this is grist for their mill. This is part of what it is that keeps them going. There's a kind of almost ambulance chase dimension to it. And I'll stop because I've already gotten myself into enough trouble. But I was deeply depressed in 2023 by the ease and deftness with which this white supremacy has done us wrong, and we Black people struggle under the boot weight on our neck, and it's 1963 all over again, was projected across cable television to the nation as the civil rights expression of our time. I was dismayed by it, frankly.
Where it's the same little impasse that we reach. I was disturbed by it because I felt that the constant implication that Tyre Nichols died because he was Black is false. However, I don't think that the people there know that. I don't think that it's a dog and pony show. I don't think that they're doing it because they want to put on a show and get attention. I mean, it's at a point. I know Dyson. He and I are about to actually do a debate, and that'll probably, now that I think of it, be all about this in Syracuse in a few months. I have, spoken at a certain length with Sharpton. I have been in a room with both of those men. We may not agree with them, but they are not insincere.
And they're not opportunists either. Excuse me.
No,
they're not opportunists.
No, they're not. It's I hate to say this because they might hear me saying this, but I honestly believe that a Black person can found their sense of significance upon this sort of thing such that they feel that this gives them a sense of purpose. And for them to widen the lens and allow that it's not 1960 would be, it would be fearsome, it would be difficult, it would be dislocating, and that's not what people do. Here's some indication of the kind of sincerity that I mean. Bamboozled was a very interesting movie. I love Spike Lee's work. He's one of my 3 favorite directors. The answer to the question people are wondering is Woody Allen and the Coen brothers. Then Spike Lee is one of my favorites. I've seen every single scrap of everything he's done. And, he's human. Sometimes he misses, sometimes he hits it, sometimes it's in the middle. Bamboozled was the first one where I felt, wow, that didn't work. And one of the reasons was that Spike felt comfortable preaching openly in a way that he doesn't usually, because he thought of these particular issues that there are certain Black people who exploit deliberately. He thought of that as just a given. He really thinks there are such people. So poor Jada Pinkett Smith having to do that speech where she shows clips of minstrelsism and has to say to him, look at what you're contributing to, as if that's how people really talk. But I think Spike Lee kind of felt like it didn't have to be the way people really talk because of that liturgy to get, monotonous. Or notice the main flaw in that film, that Damon Wayans walks around talking in that silly voice. How the main character talks like this, and Jada Pinkett actually is sleeping with him, etc. That voice that Damon Wayans was allowed to do, that is Spike Lee basically saying that, frankly, people like you and me are jackasses. That this person is not only doing something wrong, but you're going to show it by having him walk around talking like a sketch character for the entirety of what's supposed to be a relatively serious film. Huge mistake unless you realize that Spike Lee really thinks that people like him are that ridiculous, that sly, that deliberate. Honestly, that's the same thing at that funeral. There's a sincerity there. I think their lens is too narrow. I think that they've gotten caught up in a sense of their identity as being based on making that same point. But I wasn't as disgusted as you are because I don't want to step out of myself either. It's hard. It's their selves. Kamala Harris, I don't know what's in her soul. I genuinely don't. But in terms of Sharpton, certainly Crump, from what I can see. And in terms of Dyson, I don't see insincerity in them. I see a preservation of their sense of their own personhood, which I cannot be angry.
I see an irony
about.
I don't know how you can effectively denounce, quote unquote, white supremacy when you're wallowing in racialism, when you've made race everything, when you're constantly playing the race card. Kamala Harris, our nation's first Black vice president. I mean, I think that formulation, which is taken for granted, is absurd, frankly. I mean, I think Benjamin Crump is Black America's Attorney General is offensive to me. That idea, that formulation is offensive to me. I think when Sharpton speaks and uses the first person plural about the conditions of Black people in America, that I'm listening to a grifter who has a shtick, who is imposing it on us. And I can't be the only person who thinks like this. I'm probably one of the few people who will say it, in part because I have the protection of being a Black person. But I assure you that many, many, many Democratic voting, middle of the road white people looked at that show and had feelings not dissimilar from my own. I mean, the assimilation of the problem of policing in an American city in 2023 to the fight against Jim Crow is just a fraudulent move, John. You think people don't know that they're defrauding us when they make that move? You don't think they know the difference? I'm sure they know the difference. I'm sure Michael Eric Dyson knows the difference. I'm sure the Reverend Al Sharpton knows the difference. So, no, we don't agree about this. Malicious. This is not just mistaken. This is malicious.
But Glenn, they all think, pretend to think, Well, remember, they're not interested in the other data. It doesn't fit with the narrative. They all think that what's going on all over the country is cases like Tyre Nichols, like Philando Castile. He's reaching into his pocket and gets shot dead.
Yeah.
They think that's going on all over the country. They think it only happens to Black people and maybe the occasional Latino. They think, remember that the statistic is that Black people are killed by cops disproportionately. They're killed by cops at twice the rate of white people. Well, what they're all thinking is that means that 800 Black men are killed and only 400 white men. They don't know that we're talking about proportions, so that Black people are only 14%, that it's many fewer. Can't you see that I almost want to say pretend, but then again, I don't know if the people we're talking about know the numbers here. And so they think that if that were going on, wouldn't it be kind of an extension of Jim Crow? It's just that it isn't what's going on.
John, over 10,000 Black people were murdered last year. 10,000.
I know where you're going.
You think they don't know that?
They think it's different if the state does it, which I think is appalling.
Yeah, okay.
But they think it's different.
Okay.
That, I agree with you, is bullshit. As far as they're concerned, if you get shot by somebody down the street, that's regrettable, as they often put it. But if you get shot by the cop, especially because the cop is probably white, well, that is Armageddon. So
they are national leaders with the capacity to orient the conversation amongst Black people about what confronts us as difficulties in American society today. And they have elected, given that capacity, to so orient in the manner that I have been dismissive of, instead of calling us to strengthen our communities in ways that might actually change the facts on the ground, not about policing, but about the way in which too many of us conduct ourselves that makes life practically unlivable for the rest of us in these communities. The police are not the ones who caused 10,000 Black people to be murdered last year. So, okay, I've said my piece.
I hear you. I get it. I did not like listening to it either. It was a show, but I think that those people think of it as a show with a purpose. I hear you, though. I disagree with their take on the whole matter.
But you're still a fan of Al Sharpton.
I don't think that he's doing anything wrong these days. I don't know if I'm a fan, but I think allow that people change. And I think he really does think of himself as doing God's work. And God's work is about racism. That's what he does. And I think that's what he sees.
Well, like I said, it was a good show. They put on a show and they know how to do it. So, okay, we have had another hour and it's been a pleasure talking to you. Let's sign off so we can respond to questions.
Indeed.
All right. I'm going to stop us.